Honor, that is why a knight does what he does.
So what's your podcast about?
Oh, it's about psychology, true crime, supernatural stuff, the occasional paranormal or philosophical rant.
Well, maybe I could check it out sometime.
May God grant us the wisdom to discover the right, the will to choose it, and the strength to make it endure. Amen.
What's your opinion on my crusade? May God be pleased with my sacrifice.
After centuries of constant Islamic aggression, before the very first crusade was launched in 1095, Muslims had invaded the following Christian lands. They had invaded Christian Syria, Christian Jordan, Christian Palestine, Christian Egypt, Christian Algeria, Christian Libya, Christian Morocco, Christian Portugal, Christian Spain, Christian France, Christian Sicily, Christian Turkey, Christian Armenia, Christian Italy, all before the First Crusade.
Welcome to Truth and Shadow, your guide through the supernatural. I am your host, BT, and this is a Shadow Short. Let's navigate the unknown on this brief journey into the depths of mystery. The medieval mind lived somewhere between desperation, starvation, and a desire for a better future. The rhythms of war, winter, and worship ruled the lives of men and women who believed their existence was not random, but perhaps it did have a divine purpose. The 11th century opened like a scary story. Famine, plague, endless petty wars between barons and bishops, counts and kings. Across the villages of France and the Rhineland, peasants saw what they thought were omens in the sky and continued to hear sermons about repentance. Christendom became divided within itself because the power of the pulpit. People were drawn to certain orators, and the cult of personality grew for peasantry who were starving for the truth. At the heart of this broken order stood the Western Church, vast, weary. The idea of reform was in the air. The papacy was struggling to free itself from the grip of kings. They declared that only Rome could appoint bishops, that holy men should live in holy poverty, and that the sins of simony and corruption had to be purged. And this led to the investiture controversy. It was a struggle between the popes and the emperors over who could put men in cloth and give them spiritual authority, and it tore through Europe like a wildfire. And what that meant was even the pious became part of a battlefield. And then, in 1054, came the wound that never healed, the Great Schism, the finality of that. The Church of Rome in the west and the Church of Constantinople in the east, once two halves of one ancient faith, finally severed ties. They had quarreled for centuries over language and authority, but now that bond was formally broken. Each side, of course, called itself Orthodox. Each side called the other apostate. The Christians of Europe were now two civilizations, desiring the same outcome, speaking the same prayers, but maybe directed to two different thrones. It was a divided world, and in that, something unseen began to stir. It wasn't political. It wasn't even theological. It was psychological. Europe's restless and violent past needed a purpose large enough to sanctify its rage. It was as almost if we're talking about masses of people who had suppressed chaos for so long were seeking redemption through the illusion of purity. To purify the world, as if Europe was covered over by a collective shadow if we were to follow Jungian types. And the Crusades that followed the centuries, it didn't invent this condition. It was simply the final form of it. Far to the east, the great Byzantine Empire, the last torch of the Roman Empire, was fading. Its cities still glittered with the mosaics and hymnals written in the Greek, but along its borders, skirmishes broke out. The old world of imperial law and orthodox theology was under siege, and not specifically from heresy, but from the Turks, a new power rising from the steppes of Central Asia. Converted to Islam, they brought a form of discipline and the power of conversion not seen before. In 1071, the Byzantines met them in battle at Manzikert, near Lake Van in Anatolia. The imperial army fell apart. The Emperor Romanos IV was captured, and the map of Asia Minor fell into chaos. For the first time, Constantinople could feel the frontier closing in. The empire that had once withstood the Persians and Arabs now faced an enemy that moved too fast, struck too deep, and turned their people against them. By the time Alexios Komnenos I, who had seized the throne in 1081, the empire was completely fractured. Armenia, Sicilia, and much of Anatolia had slipped away. The refugees, they streamed west. The tax base crumbled, and the once great army began to rely on mercenaries, loyal only to the coin. Now, Alexios was clever. He was brave, and he was desperate. He built these alliances and strengthened his army, and then was able to stabilize the capital. But he knew the empire wouldn't survive alone. Long before the Crusades, pilgrimage had been the heartbeat of medieval devotion. To walk to Rome, Santiago, Jerusalem was not just travel, it was a type of penance that could be lived. A pilgrim's life was living prayer, hardships turned into holiness. For generations, the Byzantine Empire had protected the routes to the Holy Land, and that meant pilgrims from France, England, Germany could travel safely under imperial banners. But after Manzikert, the routes became perilous. Bandits, border wars, and shifting powers made the journey increasingly difficult. In the West, these reports fed a quiet ache that the holiest places of the faith were now out of reach. Pilgrimage began to dwindle. Meanwhile, the knighthood of Europe, a new class of armored lords, was searching for its own form of redemption. The feudal warfare had made violence a profession, leaving younger sons with no inheritance, and they turned to the sword as their only form of identity. The church saw in them both danger and opportunity. For a century, priests had preached the peace of God and the truce of God, urging knights not to fight on holy days, not to kill clergy or peasants. But those reforms failed. Violence was Europe's native language, and the papacy began to wonder, what if instead of suppressing it, they could use it? And this is where the archetype of the Redeemer warrior began to come alive. The idea that the sword could be a sacrament, or at least a sacramental, that violence could be purified if it was aimed specifically at evil. And that meant, in the 11th century, the pathology that was growing was a sanctified form of war. But a catalyst came from the east. In 1071, as the Turks advanced, Alexios Komnenos began sending letters westward appealing for help. He reached out to the Pope, the very institution that just a generation earlier had broken communion with his. But necessity is often more persuasive than doctrine. And by 1095, the emperor's request had reached Pope Urban II. Urban had his own troubles. He was a reformer, a politician, and a visionary, and he saw in Alexios' plea an opportunity to heal that split. To aid Byzantium meant that they could be reconciled east and west and unite Christendom under that one cause. And if history is a stage, this was the moment when two exhausted actors, the East and the West, turned to face each other again, each mistaking the other for salvation. By 1095, the Emperor Alexios sent his envoys west. The Christian world had already been shrinking for 400 years. To the Byzantine mind, the emperor was not merely territory, it was the body of Christ made visible on earth, and that body had been bleeding for generations. From the 7th century onward, Islam had spread with astonishing speed. Within a single lifetime after Muhammad's death in 632, armies inspired by his new faith swept through the lands that had been pillars of ancient Christianity. Between 636 and 640 AD, Syria and the Holy Land began to fall. After the Battle of Yarmouk, the Byzantine garrisons collapsed at Damascus, Antioch, and Jerusalem fell under Muslim rule. Egypt in 641, once the cradle of Christian scholarship and monasticism, Alexandria and the Nile Delta were conquered by Arab forces. The Coptic Church endured, but was isolated, taxed heavily, and marginalized. Between 647 and 698, North Africa of Christian Carthage, the seat of St. Augustine's Church, was destroyed. The Latin Christianity of Africa, once vibrant, vanished. Spain, 711 to 718, Muslim armies crossed from North Africa and defeated the Visigoth kingdom. Within a decade, nearly the whole Iberian Peninsula was under Islamic control. Southern France, in the 720s, raiding forces pressed north across the Pyrenees until checked by Charles Martel at Tours in 732, a victory that later chroniclers remembered as the battle that saved Western Christendom. Sicily fell between 827 and 902. Arab fleets had conquered the island after 75 years of war. Crete and Cyprus were taken and retaken several times. Crete remained in Muslim hands for more than a century before Byzantium regained it in 961. In Asia Minor, by 11th century, the old Byzantine heartland itself began to crumble as the Turks seized the eastern plateau. So by the time of Alexios, 2/3 of the territories that had once been Christian before the rise of Islam were now governed by Muslim powers. No chronicler in Constantinople or Rome viewed this as an accident of politics. They saw it as a centuries-long reversal of fortune, some kind of cosmic tide that had turned against the faith that had once ruled the Mediterranean world. That latest and most powerful blow that came from these Turks, originally steppe nomads, had converted to Islam and in 1071 crushed the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine army at Manzikert. Within a few years, the Turks occupied nearly all of Anatolia, Byzantium's agricultural and military core. Cities like Nicaea, Iconium, and Antioch, centers of Christianity, fell. Refugees streamed into Constantinople. The Emperor's Council record whole families arriving barefoot, carrying nothing but icons or fragments of saints' relics. And to the Byzantines, these didn't appear as mere military losses, but as truly spiritual loss. And that meant the lampstands of the churches in the east were dimming, one by one. Alexios rebuilt what he could. He struck alliances with the maritime republics, hired Norman and Turkic mercenaries, tried to play rival Muslim princes against each other. But by 1090, the empire was barely holding its frontiers, and these Turks, with the Sultanate of Rum, its capital set brazenly in Nicaea, a city where the Nicene Creed had been written, stood as a daily humiliation to the heirs of Constantinople. So in early 1095, Alexios had sent an embassy to Pope Urban II, and those bishops had gathered at council. The envoys arrived, robed in the purple of their emperor, but carrying that humility of supplicants. They described the devastation of the East, the captivity of Christians, the desecration of churches, and the loss of pilgrim safety. They did not call for conquest. The word crusade wasn't around yet, but their request was measured. They asked to have Western knights, trained mercenaries, and others to go out and reinforce the imperial armies. In exchange, Byzantium would pay and provision them, and perhaps at last, there could be a healing of the 50-year rift that had formed between the East and the West. By the 11th century, the Mediterranean was no longer a Roman lake, but a frontier between two vast civilizations. On one shore, Christian kingdoms, Byzantium, the Franks, the Germans, the Lombards, the newly Christianized people of the north. On the other, the Islamic world, diverse, brilliant, but divided among rival powers. You had the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, had once been supreme but had fallen to mere ceremony. The Turks ruled in its name across Persia and Anatolia, and the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt controlled Jerusalem itself. Despite conflict, trade and diplomacy persisted, and pilgrims continued to visit the Holy Land, though under increasingly uncertain conditions. This plea from the Byzantine Empire struck Europe's conscience like a bell. For the Knights of the West, it offered redemption through valor. For the Church, it promised unity, and for the peasants, it promised pilgrimage with more purpose. And for the Emperor in Constantinople, it offered a survival for the empire. Alexios could not have foreseen what his letter would unleash. He expected a disciplined corps of professional soldiers. What he would receive was an entire civilization in motion. Urban II took months to consider his response. He corresponded with Alexios, studied reports from the East, and prepared his next great council. This one to be held at Clermont in central France. There, he would not merely address the clerics, but nobles, knights, and the people. The aim of this council, as far as history can tell, was to call Western Christendom to defend the Eastern Church and reclaim the freedom of Christian pilgrimage. No order was given to attack Jews, none to slaughter innocents. Urban's call, preserved by multiple chroniclers, spoke only of aid, penance, and liberation of sacred places from foreign control. The crusading idea, before it became legend, was more of an act of intercession, a bridge across the fractured Christian world. The stage was set for Clermont, for a sermon that would transform desperation into destiny, and the sinister forces, if such things exist and interacted with this, would not whisper lies. Instead, they would amplify what was already going on. Now, the story of the First Crusade was a bit of an interesting situation. You see, it was November 27th in 1095, in the small French town of Clermont. Nestled among the volcanic hills of Avignon, Pope Urban II, a Frenchman by birth and a reformer by conviction, stood before an assembly of bishops, abbots, nobles, and townsfolk. The council had convened to address church reforms, but it would become something greater, a hinge on which the Middle Ages would turn. Accounts of Urban's speech varies. Chroniclers wrote their versions years later, shaped by memory or politics, yet historians can reconstruct the essence. Urban began by speaking of the suffering of the Eastern churches, how the buildings themselves were becoming defiled, that priests were being driven out, and pilgrims themselves were endangered on their way to Jerusalem. He repeated the plea sent by Emperor Alexios, urging the West to come to the defense of the Byzantine Empire. Then, according to multiple sources, Urban broadened the vision. He called not merely for mercenaries to aid Byzantium, but for an armed pilgrimage, a journey of both sword and spirit. Whoever, for devotion alone and not for honor or gain, sets out to liberate the Church of God in Jerusalem, that journey shall be counted for all penance. And with those words, Pope Urban II forged something entirely new, the Crusade Indulgence. Forgiveness of temporal punishment for sins in exchange for participation in a holy campaign. He did not promise wealth and power. He did not command conversion or annihilation, but he had given them and their desire for war meaning and a chance for redemption through purpose. Urban's audience was not a mob, but a congregation of the elites of abbots and minor nobles that could command men and resources. Yet his words carried far and wide beyond all present. It spread like wildfire throughout all of the townsfolk and peoples. At the height of his sermon, according to chroniclers, a voice cried from the crowd, a single phrase, repeated again and again and again until it thundered throughout the whole valley. Deus vult, God wills it. Urban paused, then answered, yes, God indeed wills it. Let these words be your battle cry in every danger. And it became the first slogan of a movement that would define civilization. Now, to understand Urban's purpose, one must separate the later legend from his immediate goals. Now, he did not envision an invasion of Islam as a whole, nor a conquest of foreign peoples for empire. His letters after the council, preserved and verified, reveal a much narrower mission. He wanted to defend the Eastern Christians who had appealed for help, to restore safe pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to channel knightly violence into a just and penitential cause. So he was going to send them eastward. Remember, at this same time, much of southern France, Sicily, Spain, all under the control of Islamic powers. But Urban saw the crusade as a moral reform opportunity and an antidote to the private wars that had torn Western Europe apart. He offered warriors a way to sanctify their craft and to transmute destruction into a form of devotion. From Clermont, Urban traveled across France. Through the winter and spring of 1096, he preached the same message. In letters of Bologna to Flanders, to the faithful in the Rhineland, he repeated the formula, help your brothers in the east free the road to the holy city. He set no order to attack any non-combatants or any Jews. In fact, his writings were known to forbid it. Urban's charisma was formidable. Chronicles noted that wherever he went, people wept openly, confessed their sins, they took vows, sewed crosses onto their cloaks, and took a vow that meant those signed with the cross. And that symbol was powerful. a red cloth cross stitched over the heart of a soldier, a visible sign of inner transformation. It meant farewell to home and family, a probability of never coming back, and a binding promise to march east. Now, the amazing part was the response exceeded every expectation. Princes, barons, knights from across Latin Christendom took the cross. Most notable was Godfrey of Boulogne, Duke of Lower Lorraine, Raymond IV of Toulouse, Behomad of Taranto, Robert of Normandy, and Hugh of Vermandois, brother to the King of France. Each led his own army. They were bound loosely by shared purpose, did have a divided language and loyalty, yet the idea that united them was unprecedented, that Christendom itself, fractured by war, would march under one symbol toward destiny. At the same time, thousands of commoners, inspired but unbidden, began to prepare their own pilgrimage. Their zeal would lead to the People's Crusade, a prelude to the main expedition. The first to answer Urban's call were not princes, but peasants. Through the spring of 1096, preachers crossed Europe proclaiming that the road to Jerusalem was open to all. Among them, Peter the Hermit stood out, whose fervor could ignite a market square. He promised no riches, only absolution. Tens of thousands followed him, farmers, craftsmen, women, children, and a scattering of minor knights. They believed that if God willed the journey, God would provide for it. Alexios received these early pilgrims politely, but warily when they reached Constantinople. He fed them, ferried them across the sea, the Bosporus, and urged them to wait for the professional forces still assembling in the west. They did not wait. Marching into Asia Minor, undisciplined and poorly supplied, they met the Turk forces near Sivoto in the autumn of 1096. The result was utter devastation. Most of the People's Crusade perished. A few survivors staggered back to the imperial lines. The entire episode was a tragedy, the product of zeal without any strategy. Later that year, the true expedition arrived. 4 great armies led by the nobles who had taken the cross at Clermont: Godfrey, Behomond, Raymond IV, and Robert of Normandy. They converged on Constantinople in early 1097. Emperor Alexios, cautioned after the earlier disaster, required each leader to swear an oath of homage. Any Byzantine cities they liberated would be returned to imperial control. The princes agreed, sometimes sincerely, sometimes strategically. The first target was Nicaea, the former imperial capital now held by the Turks. The siege began in May of 1097, the Byzantine engineers and Western knights cooperating. Alexios' fleet cut off the city from the lake, and when Nicaea surrendered, the emperor treated its Muslim inhabitants honorably and forbade the mercenaries and knights any looting. Soon after, the Crusaders marched east. At Dorylaeum, the Turk Sultan Arslan I ambushed the vanguard. For hours, the Crusaders held their ground under volleys of arrows until the rearguard arrived and drove the Turks into retreat. Chroniclers record hymns that were sung that saved the soldiers. The march across central Anatolia was a trail of endurance. Heat, thirst, and the distance killed more than battle. By the time the armies reached Antioch on the Orontes, they had walked nearly 1,000 miles. The siege of Antioch, which took place between October 1097 and June of 1098, was the crucible of the crusade. The city's massive walls defied attack for 8 months. Famine reduced men to eating leather, yet morale within held. But then, when a traitor opened the gate, the Crusaders poured in and took the city. Days later, a vast Muslim relief army arrived and trapped them inside, the besiegers becoming besieged. In desperation, a priest claimed to discover the Holy Lance, the spear said to have pierced Christ's side. Whether fraud or faith, the relic revived the army's spirit, and they sallied forth and broke the enemy lines. Antioch fell, and with it opened the path to Jerusalem. Bohemond kept the city and his principality with Alexios' reluctant consent, and the alliance between East and West frayed, but did not yet collapse. In early 1099, the remnants of the Crusader host, perhaps about 12,000 fighting men, out of tens of thousands who had set out, advanced through Syria. They negotiated with local rulers, some of them Muslim, some of them Christian, who preferred truces to being destroyed. At every stage, the campaign was a mosaic of warfare, diplomacy, and exhaustion. By June, they reached Jerusalem, held by the Fatimid garrison of Egypt. not by the Turks who had once ruled it. The city was well fortified, the attackers weakened, they built wooden siege towers from dismantled ships and timbers hauled from miles away, and on July 15th, 1099, after 6 weeks of fighting, the walls were breached. Contemporary chroniclers report the violence typical of medieval sieges: combat in the streets, resistance until surrender, heavy casualties on both sides. Later legend inflated these events into mythic extremes. But modern historians, reading the sources critically, find no single act that stands apart from the grim norms of 11th century warfare. The Crusaders secured the city, and within days the killing ceased. The surviving inhabitants, Muslim, Jews, and Eastern Christians, were allowed to live under the new authority. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was established, and Godfrey of Bouillon refused the title of king, called himself the advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. The campaign was complete. Against every prediction, a disunited coalition of Western lords had traversed continents and seized the most symbolically charged city on earth. The First Crusade did not end the struggle between faith and darkness. It revealed that the two often share the same battlefield, the human heart. When we look back now, we see not fanatics or saints, but men and women caught between necessity and belief, trying to find God in a violent world. They lived in an age where faith was the air one breathed, and every wound in the body of Christendom felt personal. They prayed, fought, died, believing they were healing that wound. Perhaps, in some mysterious way, they did. The modern mind, shaped by centuries of skepticism, forgets that the people of that age saw no difference between the spiritual and the political. For them, the world itself contained some kind of form of liturgy, that every decision was a prayer, and every battle cry, whether whispered or screamed, was part of it. And that's the part we forget, that the struggle for the Holy Land was also the struggle for meaning, identity, and redemption. History may record banners and battles, but heaven records the intentions. And when the dust of all empires settles, that's what remains: the intention to bring light into the world shadowed by chaos. If you've walked with me this far, through all this time and all this memory, the past isn't dead, it's mirrored in the present. The same forces that moved thrones and armies move the human soul today. The real crusade never ended, it simply changed its armor. If you'd like more journeys like this one, where history, faith, and the unseen cross paths, stay with me, for we will be examining this deeper. We'll keep following the echoes where they lead into the ruins, the cathedrals, and the human mind itself. For those who want to understand the events through the scholarship, clarity, and devotion, I recommend The Crusades, The World's Debate by Hilaire Belloc. I also recommend The First Crusade and the Idea of Crusading by Jonathan Riley Smith. Finally, to understand how devotion works like this, and how we can reflect on it and gain discipline, I recommend Divine Love Made Flesh by Cardinal Raymond Burke. The world is full of battlefields, but the only one that ever mattered lies between your ears and in your chest. It is the truth we professed and the shadow we refuse to face. Stay tuned and keep your lantern lit.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Take the red pill. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. You stay in Wonderland. whatever you want to believe. The truth, nothing more.